Good morning, my name is Faroleiro and this is Connected, the podcast of Nova Economics Club. Today, we are going to take our attention to real estate market in Portugal. So, to bring us light on this topic, we have here the Professor Paulo Rodrigues. Welcome. He is an adjunct professor at Nova SPE. He holds a PhD in econometrics from the University of Manchester and develops research in theoretical and applied econometrics to finance and economy. So, let's start. Okay, Professor, you have recently coordinated a study in the Portuguese housing market, in particular the importance of housing in householders' consumption, the effect of the ban on new leases for short-term rent and urban leases. Could you elaborate on the aim of the study and the motivation behind it?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be here and to talk to you about this topic. The book was a nice project that we developed, and the main idea of this book was basically to provide a first characterization of certain dimensions of the real estate market in Portugal. The book is not aimed to be sort of like an exhaustive study because it's very difficult. There are so many dimensions to the real estate market that it's very difficult to cover all of them. But in the book, we managed to cover at least some of them that we feel quite important. So we had a nice group of researchers participating, and each set of researchers contributed with a chapter to this book. So, for instance, we have a chapter on the importance of housing in Portugal, where basically sort of like the housing or the importance of the housing is analyzed from a macroeconomic perspective and compared to the EU. We have a chapter on the exuberance, which nowadays is quite important, on the exuberance and contagion of house prices as well. We have a chapter on the synchronism of Portuguese house prices. So, to a certain extent, a comparison of house price synchronization is made within the country and also with a comparison with countries from Europe. We have a chapter on housing affordability, which is also quite an important topic. An analysis is made within the whole country where basically affordability is studied and checked how it basically differs across the country. We have the chapter on short-term rentals and real estate prices in Lisbon. So basically the analysis of the ban on short-term rentals or Airbnbs, if you like, in certain neighborhoods. And finally, the last chapter, which is also quite important, is a chapter that relates to urban rents in Portugal. So there are many more other dimensions that could be addressed, but we feel that this book, to a certain extent, can be sort of like a starting point for further research afterwards.
So, you concluded that the ban of the issues of license of short-term rent introduced by municipality of Lisbon in 2008 produced a 9% decreases in the housing price, reflecting the importance of short-term rent such as Airbnb on housing price. I have two questions about this issue. The first one is how much of the inflation in the real estate can be traced back to increase in short-term renting, such as Airbnb. The other one, and now you can you can answer as you wish. Um, so, if such casualty indeed exists, could the rental market prove to be the way for policy markets to tackle the spiral of housing inflation?
Thank you very much for this question. This is also a very interesting question. This sort of like these conclusions, they are from the chapter related to the band that you referred to, and this was a contribution by, if I remember correctly, Eduardo Gonçalves, Susana Peralta, and João Pereira dos Santos. And in this case, coming back now to your question, I think the first question you ask is quite hard in a sense because I don't think I have data at the moment to be able to answer towards the contribution of short-term rents to the inflation of house prices. What I can tell you to a certain extent is that short-term rents and Airbnb to a certain extent, more Airbnb in a sense, are becoming sort of like problematic in many cities, not just in Portugal, but all over the world. And particularly in places like Lisbon, where tourism is becoming quite strong. We know that Portugal is quite dependent on tourism, and Lisbon overall has been quite dynamic in that sense. So together with that, I mean, Airbnb has been increasing quite a lot, and you see that the number of Airbnb places has also been increasing. The main sort of like, let's put it, if you want to call it an advantage, is that to a certain extent, rundown neighborhoods are becoming more refurbished, are renovated. So you see that basically you see new buildings or renovated buildings showing up, but it has sort of like a negative aspect, and the negative aspect is sort of like related to gentrification, because you see that people that usually lived in those places, they're basically kicked out of there, or at least they have to move out because prices are becoming high. So to a certain extent, Airbnbs, they also put a pressure not only on house prices, but they also put a pressure on rents, because you see that to a certain extent, what happens is that you have more and more people opening up Airbnbs, and given that the supply side of houses to a certain extent limited, you're basically taking away long-term renting facilities, so to speak, and transforming them into short-term renting. So to a certain extent, that will exert some pressure on renting prices. At the same time, you also see people investing for the purpose of opening Airbnbs. So there's an increase in demand. So in that sense, that will also increase prices. So what I'm basically aiming to say here is that although I cannot quantify the impact that this had on house price inflation, I'm sure that it has some significant impact for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, regarding the second one,
Oh, regarding the second one, it's about could the rental market prove to be the way for policy markets to take the spiral on housing inflation?
I think Portugal is quite peculiar in that sense, because I would say that the rental market is clearly an important market, but until now we still had sort of like this cultural thing that everybody needs to own a house. So everybody wants to buy its own house, and renting is really sort of like a second order option. Of course, owning a house to a certain extent is also an anchor. So if you believe in mobility, and nowadays mobility is quite important, because I can have a job in Lisbon today and tomorrow I want to live in Porto. So getting rid of my house in Lisbon is not so easy. So renting can be an interesting option for that. However, um, the way the rental market is in Portugal at the moment, it's not so appealing, let's put it like that, neither to people that rent, neither to the landlords in a sense, because to a certain extent, you need to have more rental facilities, so you need to have more spaces that people can rent, but at the same time, you also need to have regulation that protects both the landlord and the tenant, and that's something that doesn't exist. So coming back to the question whether the rental market could basically be used to control price inflation, I believe that it could eventually sort of try to decrease the demand on houses for purchase, and in that sense could be sort of like a nice way to eventually accommodate that. But at the same time, there's always a trade-off between prices and rents. So essentially, you cannot disconnect renting prices from house prices. So eventually, either you increase the renting market and allow people to have other options and reduce the pressure on house purchase, and that could be something that is difficult to do through policymakers. I mean, policymakers can regulate the market, the rental market, but they cannot really regulate the prices. I think that would be a little bit harder to do. So you can have sort of like let's call it social rents for a certain group, but in general for the market, I don't think you will be able to do that.
Wow. Okay. Our next question is the real estate has proven to be a quite volatile market, thus contributing to higher business cycle fluctuation. There exists some literature arguing for agents' irrationality as one of the origins of housing market volatility. Housing harder to quantify such a fact. Do you believe this to be true, or does the answer lies on it? So, more structural causes. In other words, how can economists explain the volatility of housing markets?
Um, I mean, the idea or the concept of irrationality is quite an old concept in a sense. If you think back to some literature that emerged in the 80s, 70s, 80s. It was already a concept that emerged there. It's a difficult concept. And this has led in the past to the development of behavioral models. So if you think about some recent Nobel Prize like Richard Thaler or Robert Schiller, I mean, to a certain extent, their contributions to this type of economic analysis has been quite important in that sense. And essentially, what they try to do there is try to capture sort of like this irrational behavior of agents resorting to other social sciences like psychology and sociology. Now, from the perspective of the volatility, of course, I mean, this irrational behavior to a certain extent can be one of the reasons of this housing market volatility. But again, bringing this back to Portugal, to a certain extent, I believe that there are several issues at play at the moment, and of course, eventually, some irrationality may be there because of speculative behaviors by some agents. But in general, there are several features that one needs to take into consideration. So, for instance, in our analysis, we typically like to relate house prices to the main drivers of those house prices. So, if you think about fundamental variables, or let's call them explanatory variables that eventually can explain the house prices, um, you see that to a certain extent, until I would say around 2017, those drivers were actually able to explain house price. And by drivers, I mean interest rates, I mean income, I mean gross fixed capital formation in real estate, um, loans, the volume of loans, etc. So that was able basically to explain at least the main behavior of house prices. From 2017 onwards, things changed a little bit. So what we observe is that, in fact, from 2017 onwards, house prices seem to have accelerated more than those variables. So, for instance, income, interest rates, and so on, all those macro variables that traditionally were used to model house prices are no longer growing at the same speed as house prices. So you see that, in fact, there's something else going on. Now, saying that this is irrational behavior is a little bit strong at the moment because, unfortunately, from the data that we are not really able to measure other aspects. So, for instance, it would be useful to include in the models things like tourism, these Airbnbs that we talked about earlier, and even foreign investment in real estate. Because to a certain extent, it is our belief, and I doctor believe at the moment still, that this real estate, the foreign investment in real estate has been one important driver of this as well. So to a certain extent, this volatility in Portugal, there could be some irrationality behind it, but to a certain extent, I would say at the moment, it's also the popularity of Portugal. I mean, people like to come here nowadays. You have lots of people, foreign people coming to Portugal, purchasing houses here, so investing. So it could be a little bit of that, but at the same time, it could be also a little bit of irrationality.
Okay. Um, so, since the subprime mortgage crisis, economists have been more attentive in incorporating financial markets frictions into their models. However, given that housing constitutes the largest share of householders' balance sheet composition, do you believe that the role of the real estate market is shaping householders' decisions and its consequence for the overall economy? Is it still underevaluated? Could it explain, for instance, why macro models have performed so poorly in the predicting bubbles?
No, this is a very good question. This is a very interesting question. No, I think that housing and to a certain extent, the weight of housing is basically well perceived by economists and policymakers. So nowadays, I would say again, since the subprime crisis in 2008, particularly, um, the real estate market has become an important market to analyze and to monitor, because I mean, to a certain extent, like you said, it has a huge weight in the families' lives. So in that sense, it's an important variable to consider, and I believe that people have been paying a lot of attention to this variable. Now, the questions that we have is that, like I was mentioning earlier, I mean, to a certain extent, it's a hot markets nowadays. It hasn't been until 2014, and at the same time, the information content that is still being built. So what I mean is that if you compare, let's say, Portugal to the US, where you have quite rich databases where you can analyze the states and you can analyze house prices by states, you cannot not do that yet in Portugal. Although in the book we already do a analysis by municipality, but this is sort of like a univariate analysis where we only have the house prices by municipality. So other variables, other macro variables, which would be important to have, we could not find yet. Um, on the other hand, what this basically means is that this doesn't put aside the importance that the housing market has for economists and policymakers. So nowadays, you have in most institutions that actually look into this, you have models that actually predict the behavior of house prices and the behavior of the evolution of house prices, because these are important variables to include also in models that you want to sort of use for your decisions and for your analysis in that sense. Regarding the bubbles and the bad performance of bubbles, it's true that they haven't been working as well as eventually we would like to. But on the other hand, identification and forecasting of bubbles is very difficult. I mean, if we knew that a bubble would occur and if you are a rational agent, we probably would avoid it, right? So to a certain extent, it would not exist. So it's not an easy task to do. But I think that with the tools that we nowadays already have and with the monitoring that is going on, I think there's already quite a good perception of how things are evolving and whether potentially a bubble could be forming or not, so that policymakers could eventually intervene if there's a way to intervene.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question and the topic. Yeah, but the part about the bubbles in the market is very difficult to identify, as you said.
Mhm.
So, following the recent spike in the interest rates, householders' willingness to borrow should damp, rendering a fall in the housing prices. In addition, under borrowing limits defined by the value of the colorated, typically houses of debtors, it should further amplify the drop in the real estate demand. In this case, we're talking about financial accelerator theory. Could such monetary policy change channel produce, even if temporarily, a drop in the housing inflation?
I believe so. I mean, looking at the current circumstances, I believe so in the sense that coming back to what I mentioned at the beginning when we talked about the rental market. So, like I mentioned, I mean, to a certain extent, we still have this culture of owning a house. So a large part of the population actually owns their house or at least purchased their house. And many people are still sort of like taking mortgages to pay their houses. So it was okay until now, so to speak, in terms of interest rates, because we had to have very low interest rates. And now with the spiking of the interest rate, as you mentioned, um, it will become hard for many families to basically sort of accommodate all these extra expenses, not only because of the high interest rates, but also inflation is increasing a lot as well. So to a certain extent, we have here two phenomena which will impact a family's saving rates and to a certain extent impact their daily lives, right? So in the book, I think it's in the first chapter by Pedro Brink and João Duarte, they actually mention something which is the notion of wealthy hand-to-mouth families, which means that you have families which, in terms of richness or in terms of, let's say, assets, they are well off, but in terms of liquidity, they don't have a lot of liquidity. So if you have a shock to the economy and liquidity is necessary, these families will struggle quite a bit. So what this means is that to a certain extent, coming back to the channel, I believe that a spike in interest rates associated with an increase in inflation will surely sort of dampen a little bit, at least the demand for houses. Because I mean, one of the sort of handicaps, so to speak, of the market at the moment is that we have sort of like an imbalance between supply and demand. So although there are many houses which are vacant, they're not really available for sale. Right, so you have many people that actually own second homes, and many houses are vacant, so people are not really renting them out. Them out, and so you have a supply issue. At the same time, you have people that actually need and want to buy a house. Of course, at current mortgage rates, they would still be able to afford them and would able to jump into buying a house. But if in fact interest rates increase a lot, they will probably postpone a little bit the purchase, and that to a certain extent should dampen a little bit the prices. I mean, that's what
That's
we think.
yeah. As someone of Lisbon, this is a topic that I have a really interest on because is a problem that they could be my own problem. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, to me it was in my name and the name of the Nova Economics Club. Was a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, thank
Thank
you
you a
very
lot.
much. No, thank you very much for the opportunity.
So now that's all, and stay connected. Thank you.